So Julia tells me that we had 290 registrants for this particular series, and our week one video has been trending as number one on their CUAHSI series. So she's going to upload this to her to the CUAHSI YouTube channel. So that's something you all can look at after the webinar. Yeah, let's keep this trending.
All right. Thank you for joining us today, everybody. We're going to wait just a second for people to get connected. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today. This webinar series has been convened by the Critical Zone Network, Early Career Network, in partnership with the Critical Zone Collaborative Network. This is the first series of a number of series that the CZN Early Career Network has planned, with the goal of enhancing collaboration and synthesis across CZ Observatory and watershed sites. This is the second week of this Cyberseminar Series, Introduction to the Critical Zone Observatories and Watershed Sites. This will be a 6-part series in all, and will continue each week at this time until September 28th. If you'd like to watch last week's session, please visit the CUAHSI YouTube channel. The recording is there, and this recording will also be posted shortly after the session today. My name is Julia Masterman. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for CUAHSI. CUAHSI is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels through programs like this Cyberseminar Series. CUAHSI also serves as the national coordinating hub for the Critical Zone Collaborative Network, or CZCN. We're thankful to members of the CZ Network team for their contributions to this series. I would encourage you to reach out to me, visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, or join our community Slack channel to learn more about CUAHSI or to get involved. I'll add information on all of those things in the chat in just a moment. Before we get started and I hand it off to our fantastic speakers for today, a few logistical things. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to our panelists rather than the chat. And finally, we expect that all involved with CUAHSI Cyberseminars promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. Thank you for being a part of that. Thank you again for joining us for this CZN Early Career Network, and for CZN Early Career Network for putting together this fantastic lineup of presentations, and for our presenters for taking the time to join us today from across the world and across all time zones. We really appreciate you joining us. Today's session will be about Alpine and Arctic sites. And with that, I will pass the mic to CZN Early Career Network Steering Committee member and research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Bhavna Arora.
Thanks, Julia. Could I share? Okay, perfect. So welcome, everyone. I'm Bhavna Arora, as Julia announced that already. I'm really thrilled to be organizing this seminar series with my early career cohort team and in partnership with the Critical Zone Collaborative Network. This week focuses on the Alpine and Arctic sites. And the purpose of this Critical Zone series is to introduce us mutually to the different Critical Zone sites and networks with an eye towards increasing synthesis and collaboration across these networks. So thinking about a foundation to do together what would be impossible to do alone. And a roadmap for our success is really thinking about the end goal here, which is towards transferable and broadly applicable questions, tools, and approaches. The timeline for this particular webinar is we have this series this week introduces 5 different speakers with 7-minute talks again, focusing on collaboration and synthesis opportunities within the Alpine and vulnerable sites or Arctic sites. We have another seminar series planned, which is looking into tools for integrating and synthesizing data from the various critical zone observatories and watershed sites, which would be held between October and November of 2021. The eye towards this entire organization is really to guide a fall meeting workshop coming up within the AGU fall meeting, which is thinking about engaging an early career cohort and developing a network of networks from an international, across the international sites and watersheds. And again, thinking about sharing science tools, data, and philosophy. That registration will be shared in the chat. So do get engaged with this team. Our website is linked below, and we can provide that information in the chat once more. With that, I want to hand this over to my cohort, Claire, to introduce our speakers and move this forward.
Thanks so much, Bhavna. Hi, everyone. So glad you could join us today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stan Wullschleger from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for our first talk.
Well, thank you, Claire. And let me share my slides if I can. And Claire, do you need to stop sharing yours?
I think Bhavna, could you, unshare? There we go. Thank you.
And there we go.
Looks
you see
good.
Those okay, Claire?
Yep, it looks great. Thanks, Stan.
All right. Well, Claire, thank you very much, along with Julia and Bhavna, for the invitation today. I certainly look forward to the discussion, and I have long been impressed with the CUAHSI as well as the critical zone observatories. And I think as I step through my slides today, you will actually see some similarities with our next generation ecosystem experiments project, or NG Arctic. I serve as the principal investigator of this project and represent about 140 scientists that are working in the lab, in the field, and modelers, trying to better understand tundra ecosystems, largely in Alaska. Now, the project is funded by the Department of Energy, and we have been in operation since 2012. And while we work in the field and the laboratory, our ultimate goal is to provide a process-rich ecosystem model of tundra ecosystems, extending from the bedrock to the top of the vegetation zone. And so in many ways has that flavor of the critical zone observatory with a large focus on hydrology. And ultimately what we're wanting to do is to take this information and incorporate it into Earth system models for global climate forecasts. Now, early in the project, in phase one, we were focused on permafrost thaw and shrub expansion. And now in phase three, we continue to have that as a focus. But we've also added, because of our understanding of tundra ecosystems, a strong hydrology and water distribution component. Over the initial few years of the project, we observed situations where we had ground subsidence, thermokarst formation, preferential flow paths, and we came to understand how linked the landscape itself was with hydrology and water distribution. And so we have now added that as a third component of our project. Now, early in phase one, we had a single site on the North Slope of Alaska. This was located outside of Barrow, or now renamed Utqiagvik, Alaska. We had the opportunity to work with our colleagues at the atmospheric measurement facility in Utqiagvik, work on the Barrow Environmental Observatory, get off to a quick start, and establish a number of field sites in polygonal landscapes, both replicated field plots as well as linear transects that went across low-centered polygons, flat-centered and high-centered polygons, and extending out into drained fall lake basins. We were also able to, over that time, instrument all of our field sites with eddy covariance and communications, as well as a unique 75-meter tram system for near-surface remote sensing of vegetation and hydrology across the landscape. And then in phase two, we were able to expand into the Seward Peninsula and add sites in southern Alaska and capitalize on the road network outside of Nome to establish field sites that allowed us to study shrubs as well as disturbances like thermokarst, as well as fire, a couple things that we were not able to do on the North Slope of Alaska. We established field sites out each of the three roads that radiate out from Nome and work with a number of native corporations along the Teller Road, the Cougarock Road, and the Council Road. And you can just see some of those landscapes and how they might compare to the polygonal inundated landscapes of the North Slope of Alaska. Similarly, we were able to instrument those field sites with communications, eddy covariance, and then water samplers for water chemistry and sampling of that across the landscape, as well as vertically into what at this site was a discontinuous permafrost, and then also looking at the use of drones to characterize the landscape. Now, in terms of some of the questions that we've been able to address and overarching observations at our site is that thermokarsts quickly form in these environments, and from a hydrology perspective, we have preferential flow paths that develop across the landscape. We also have discontinuous permafrost and preferential development of talics, which are incomplete refreezing of soils in the winter. And because of those, there are different patterns of not only surface, but subsurface water flow and discharge to surrounding streams, as well as shrub expansion, particularly nitrogen fixing alder. Now, we think there are a number of drivers associated with these processes, such as warm summers, warming winters, and interactions with snow and shrub distribution. And in terms of engaging the local communities, as I indicated, we work with a number of our native corporations, provide them annual reports, and then partner with a number of others, including federal agencies, to not only share observations and data, which we do through our NG Arctic data portal, but engage as well in a variety of synthesis activities. And so with that, Claire, thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing my screen at this point.
Thanks very much, Stan. Some wonderful looking instrumentation that you have up there. Okay, so we're going to move quickly to our next speaker. And of course, just a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end. So our next speaker is Melissa Lafreniere from Queen's University.
Hi, thank you, Claire, for the invite. I'm really happy to be here, and it's great to see all the other presenters here today. So I'm just going to get this into start. Here we go. So yeah, thanks. So today I'm going to introduce to you a research site where I've been conducting some work for the past 15 years or so. So this is the Cape Bounty Arctic Watershed Observatory. And this site, the research has been broadly focused on understanding the hydrological and biogeochemical responses of watersheds to climate and permafrost change. And I want to take a moment to also mention and acknowledge Dr. Scott Lemerew, who is the co-director and founder of the Cape Bounty Arctic Watershed Observatory. So he founded this site back in 2003 and really was the sort of driving force behind all of the collaborative work that has gone on there since. So this site is located in the Canadian High Arctic. It's on Melville Island, so down here, so we're at about 75 degrees north and about 109 degrees west. The mean summer temperatures as recorded at our site are about 3 degrees Celsius, plus or minus. We do have some, we have experienced some pretty warm days in July over the last 5 or so years, up to records of sort of 20 degrees or more, but those are pretty unusual. We are in the continuous permafrost zones, so we have a seasonally thawed active layer that might reach up to about 70 to a meter in depth at the drier sites. So these are kind of the maximum active layer depths. The area, the geologies consists of unconsolidated Holocene marine sediment that's draped over Devonian sandstone and siltstones that are part of the Franklin sort of fold belt in this area. So the study site was kind of founded around two principal watersheds that are about 10 kilometers squared. And so we have the West River watershed and the East River watershed, and each of these drain into freshwater lakes that are, they're about, both the watersheds and the lakes are very similar in size and topography. The topography here ranges from about 10 meters above sea level to about 130 meters at maximum elevations around the Cape. So we've been observing hydroclimate and other sort of terrestrial ecosystem processes here since about 2003, and that's continued in up until 2019. Of course, we've been sort of locked out of the Arctic as a result of COVID, so the last 2 seasons have we haven't been able to get there. We have here's a map just illustrating some of the smaller watersheds that we look at. So within the West River watershed, we developed a series of hill slope catchments in order to, at first we were looking to understand the impacts of some of the permafrost disturbances that occurred in the watershed in 2007. So we had examined a couple of sites, hill slope sites prior to that. And then after these disturbances occurred, we sought to broaden the range of sites that we were monitoring in order to examine just what were the impacts of these disturbances on sediment, nutrient, and other fluxes from the slopes. Since then, some of these sites have been abandoned and new sites have been introduced in order to look at different watersheds with different vegetation cover and so on. But essentially, we have a number of records that span different scales of watersheds and that have examined everything from the actual water fluxes to nutrient, solute, and sediment fluxes as well. So logistics getting here not simple, which I suppose is not surprising given we're in the Canadian Arctic. So to get to the site, we fly via commercial airline from Ottawa to Resolute Bay. And from there, our work is supported by the federal Canadian government's Polar Continental Shelf Program. And they provide us with aircraft, Twin Otter, helicopter, aircraft support, as well as other logistics support. So they provide us with our sort of sleeping tents, fuel, and snowmobiles and ATVs and so on. And so these photos kind of give you a sense of some of that logistics. So when we arrive to open camp in the winter, we will land on the lake ice, and we move and haul our gear around on snowmobiles and cometics. And then in the summer, you can see the photo down below, we land on a strip, which is essentially a tundra slash alluvial fan, where we have a strip there in front of camp. So in terms of facilities here, we have a capacity to accommodate about 10 to 11 sort of researchers comfortably. We each sleep in our own individual sort of tents, but then we have these sort of communal, a mess tent where we eat and cook. And this, as well as the lab tent, which is the second tent in that upper image, both of these tents are heated, so they're nice and dry and comfy. Here are a few other pictures of the inside of the lab tent, which we've called Quality. So the Queen's Arctic Water Laboratory Facility. So here we have a fume hood for acids and power. So we have a solar system that powers the lab, along with, we have access to gas generators to sort of supplement power as need be. So we have pumps for filtering and so on. And it's just a nice, clean and warm place to do some of the more detailed sort of biogeochemical analyses and sample prep work. So really this site, we've been focused on looking at all sorts of different process research. So we have equipment for most sort of hydroclimate type of work. So we have meteorological stations across the watersheds, as well as river gauging stations. Again, these are kind of at nested scales, and these support sediment solute contaminant flux studies. We have equipment and projects that have examined atmospheric and aquatic greenhouse gas fluxes. So including a eddy covariance flux tower, as well as some soil gas or auto chambers. And we also have sites where the active layer is monitored with temperature, moisture, electroconductivity sensors, and where we monitor across different vegetation types or land cover types. And we also have a ITEX site, so the International Tundra Experiment sites. So this is a location where we have repeated plots with snow fences and open top chambers in order to examine the effects of snow accumulation and warming on vegetation and carbon and nutrients in soils. And we also have collaborators that have accumulated SAR and multispectral remote sensing imagery over the years to look at biomass and soil moisture changes. We also have a number of studies that looked at the limnology, both the sort of thermal, hydrochemical, and sediment dynamics in both the West and East Lakes as well. So this is just a timeline of some of the research that's gone on. So starting in 2003, really the focus was the sort of hydroclimate studies, along with the remote sensing work. And then we've sort of gradually built over the years with funding from, going back to the International Polar Year and across years there. So I don't know if I'm seeing people popping up, so I think I'm out of time here. Sorry about that. I wasn't keeping a track of things, but just to sum it up, my last slide, some of the key insights we've gained here over this long period of time is just we've observed hydrological shifts in the timing of snowmelt and rainfall runoff as important controls on all of these fluxes. We've observed the impact of permafrost thaw and disturbance on opening up new sort of hydrological flow paths, as well as priming the watersheds by releasing different materials. And overall, what we found is that you can't look at any of these things, any of the biogeochemical changes have to be considered within the context of hydrological connectivity. And so really, I was excited to be invited because I think to continue to probe these systems and their responses, we have to really get on board with an integrated and coordinated group of researchers, or networks of networks, if you will. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Melissa. That was great. Okay, so moving along, our next speaker is Dr. Yangjian Zhang from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. You can go ahead and share.
Okay, so
thank you.
Great. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk. So I will introduce my work in the plateau. So okay. Oh. So Tibetan Plateau is the largest and the highest plateau in the world, and climate has been warming at a rate or twice the global average. And in here, we can see ecosystem is very fragile, and besides that, the soil depth is very shallow, so it's a typical critical dome. And in here, we have stations 4,600 meters high. Here we have a station, so pretty much we do like track the ecosystem dynamics and the driving force and the mechanisms behind. And based on the three above, we do ecosystem management. So this our station, you can see at the landscape. So like we are, the landscape is overlapping pretty much with a watershed. And we have like from plot to landscape and to regional scale. And if you zoom into the landscape, you can see the watershed from the north to south. And in here, we have a Convened tower series to monitor biogeochemical cycle. And we have deep wells for the up to the rock. And so our aim is to up to the atmosphere and deep into the rock and across the watershed to monitor everything. And so here, how we do that? Like at the plot scale, we do some survey. And in low sky, we use UAV. And in the high sky, we use satellite remote sensing. So pretty much we have like experiment to reveal the mechanism. And then for the like landscape scale, we use UAV. And then we have like a transect survey. Then we reach our target from plot to regional scale. And in terms of experiments, we have gradient and nitrogen addition and etc. So like for this one, we have a OTC. So we're trying to simulate like 1 Celsius degree, 2 Celsius degree, and 3 Celsius degree warming. And based on that, we found that in a warming gradient for the shallow species, shallow root, their phenology will delay it on the warming. But for the deep root, they actually advance. And besides that, we found a low level warming will have no impact on the species composition, but high level warming will change species composition. The reason is that high level warming will dry out the soil and fill out some species of shallow roots. And second one, we have like a elevated carbon dioxide. The reason is that in high altitude, the carbon dioxide, the partial pressure is lower than in lowland area. So we found that actually if we do like individual nitrogen addition or the elevated carbon dioxide, they don't have obvious effects, but their combination will significantly increase above ground biomass. Second is that Well, individual, they will have no effects on biodiversity, but the combination will decrease richness and evenness. Put a global scale, we found that the magnitude for carbon dioxide stimulation on GPP will increase with the altitude. It means that high altitude, we see stronger stimulation effects on GPP. These are from plot to landscape to regional scale. How do we do that? So like our landscape, we use UAV. What we did, we monitor the pika, the larvae animal, what's the activity magnitude. Like here, we found our remote sensing, we can extract information for pika hole density. And then if we compare grazing and non-grazing area, we found that pika hole density in grazing area is higher than ungrazing area. The last one is that do a cross-scale analysis for carbon use efficiency. That's a very important ecosystem parameter. So basically, it's MPP divided by GPP. And we do plot scale for the experiments. Landscapes, we do like a ethical awareness monitoring. For regional scale, we do integration. And for regional scale, and again, we do model simulation. Basically, what we found is that under warming climate, the MPP GBP ratio will decrease on the dependent plateau for the 3 scales. So that's our side. So welcome to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yangjian. That was great. Thank you. And we're back on schedule now, so that's really wonderful. Very interesting work. I love the UAVs and monitoring those pika holes. It's really interesting. Okay, so moving along to our next speaker, Heidi Steltzer from Fort Lewis College.
All right, I think I'm set up now. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
And I've requested that it go to full presentation. There we go. Thank you so much to CUAHSI for inviting me, and thank you to all the speakers so far and the ones to come. This is more than I've traveled in quite some time, and you're showing me some of my favorite places in the world, places that I've been and places that I want to go. So thank you so much. I'd like to share with you insights from Colorado's Rocky Mountains. So I live here in Colorado. I've lived here in Colorado since 1994. I work with the Berkely Labs Watershed Function Scientific Focus Area, which is a U.S. Department of Energy research project. And they established the East River Community Watershed here in Colorado on the East River. Very different looking East River from the one that Melissa shared with us from the high Arctic, but some common features that I can see. I've shared contact information there for me, and yeah, let's move on. Where in the world are we? We're looking at North America, and we're looking at that this watershed is located in the headwaters for the Colorado River. And the Colorado River provides water to a vast region of the Western US. What you're looking at in the map from a USGS website is the pink, that darker pink region, is where the water traditionally flows. And then with all the irrigation systems that are put in, there are parts of that region where the water doesn't flow, and there are other parts of the region that receive some of the Colorado River water. Across and in our region, we have a elevation gradient. So what I wanted to focus on is one key thing to share with you about site characteristics for this community watershed is that there are sites from a montane elevation to alpine zones. So montane elevations are tend to be drought limited, water limited, and then the upper elevation range at our watershed tends to be energy limited, with traditionally in the past snowpack that would last so long and be so deep that a growing season might only be 1 or 2 months long. Some of the places where we dig snow pits in this watershed have 3 meters of snow. So the elevation here that you're seeing is the range that there are micrometeorological stations that have been in place for about 5-8 years, I believe. Some records for microclimate or for climate in this region go back 40 years or more and include individual observations, as well as Colorado has a network of snow-tell sites that are in place to help water planners characterize and understand annual water flow in a way that we can predict and understand how to manage water better in the West. So the photo that I'm showing you up at the top is what an Alpine site looks like late in the season, before all the snow is melted, but when a wide range of the mountains have popped out and are no longer snow covered. So I focused my presentation a little bit different in wanting to provide more on what are the big ideas? What are the big ideas that I would love to see carried forward in some way to this network? The first story to tell you is that extreme climate years are happening here in Colorado, and they're happening more often. I wouldn't have guessed that Colorado would feel like it does these days when I started my PhD in Colorado back in 1994. This graph is a graph I put together this summer to try and start to tell this story. So what you see on the x-axis is snowmelt date. So our snowmelt season can range anywhere from late April through into July. 1995, that year on the far right, that was the first year of my PhD research. So I started my PhD in an extreme climate year when I couldn't even get to most of my field sites until July. And these days, we're pressed more and more to try and get out to our sites in April and May, both because I'm working at some lower elevations, but also because the snow is melting fairly early in most years. We look and focus a lot in alpine and Arctic environments on earlier snowmelt. And I worked on the IPCC SROC report on what's going on with the cryosphere, the oceans and the cryosphere across our planet. And we tried to tell a lot of the stories of the snow and the snow alone, or the glaciers and the snow and the permafrost, and to focus on the cryosphere. This graph aims to show you that the temperature regime at the time that snow melts in the near 14-day period of time after a location is snow-free is also different when snow melts early. And so about 28% of the variation in thaw-degree days for a period of 14 days after a location is snow-free can be explained by that date when sites are snow-free. The open circles are one snow-tell station. The black circles are another snow-tell station. These are the historical data that we have for the area. What we've added to this, and I've added to this graph, is on the next slide, which is that each of those letters is a recent snowmelt year. It's a recent year. So the DOE effort has been in place since 2015 was the first year we were doing projects. 2016 was when we first got funding. And so these years are 2017 through 2020. And during those 4 years, we also conducted an earlier snowmelt experiment. All of those points, those letter points, are towards the upper end of the cloud of gray points. So snow is melting earlier. When we include sites from across elevation, we can span the historical range of timing of snowmelts. And each of those arrows, from a small letter to a capital letter, represents a shift in snowmelt date that corresponded to also a shift in thaw-degree days after snowmelt as a result of an experimental treatment we put in place. So we did an early snowmelt experiment to push the system so we could understand early snowmelt, and we have to interpret our results in the context of that those early snowmelt plots tend to also be cooler as a result of being snow-free earlier. So I feel like this type of approach to data analysis and trying to think about how timing of snow cover loss and warmth of our systems is something that we could look at in a coordinated way across our sites. Now this has a lot more on it, and this is the last of the graph slides. There's elevation on the x-axis. In the whole stack of graphs on the left is first leafing dates, and the whole stack of graphs on the right is first flowering dates. And the main thing to see here is that that line across elevation, what's the variation, the bioclimatic variation across elevation in different years. So in 2017 and in 2018, we can see that it shifts more for flowering. 2018 was an unusually early snowmelt and a particularly warm year. So when we go from 2017 to 2018, we can see in particular that flowering shifts quite a bit and is more synchronized. And then in 2018, we also had the early snowmelt experiment, and we can see an even greater shift, both for the timing of first leaf and for the timing of first flowering. In these patterns that we're seeing them more and more. This year, 2021, was a early snowmelt year. It was very warm because of those heat domes that were forming in different regions around the world. We had a particularly warm period right after snowmelt here in Colorado. And we didn't have data from this year because we didn't continue the same monitoring this year, but I could see that the plants were flowering earlier and flowering in a more synchronized timeline across elevation as a result of those patterns of climate. So what are some further ideas for collaboration? I can't help but wonder what if the mountain peaks were higher? Would there be a threshold to the synchronization due to, for example, cooler temperatures at more extreme elevations? With the three sites that we've seen already, I could see a question like this being really relevant to the Tibetan Plateau work, and also of interest in a site like the high Arctic, where the peaks aren't as high, but the latitude is more extreme. The second area for collaboration that I can see is when we see these extreme climate patterns around the globe, such as heat domes that happen this summer, how can we coordinate and collaborate to study the global impacts in mountain and Arctic regions? And sorry that I left the Arctic regions out of that, because those heat domes certainly had wide-ranging effects across Russia, across Canada, across Northern Europe, and down into more temperate regions in the mountains. So with that, I will pass to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Appreciate that, those thoughts at the end there. Okay, so we're going to move now to our last speaker, Dr. Phil Marsh from Wilfrid Laurier University.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, all good.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the invitation and opportunity to talk today about our ongoing research at our Trail Valley Creek site in the Canadian Arctic. So our overall project, which we've been ongoing studies in the Western Canadian Arctic since about 1991, is really to look at ecosystem changes that result from complex interactions in the environment. So there's some obviously well-known changes that are occurring. It's a rapidly warming climate, and in this region of the Arctic, there's decreasing rain and decreasing snowfall as well. So those result in a pretty broad environmental change, expanding shrubs across the tundra landscape, thawing of ice-rich permafrost, and possibly increasing fires. But the impacts of all of these are pretty complex, and the changes are really poorly understood. So there's changes in the disappearance of lakes, for example. We've been seeing rapid changes in the increase in rapidly draining lakes, changes in lake levels, probably formation of new lakes, and changing stream flow as well. So we have a transect of sites located along the recently completed Inuvik-Tutuk Highway, and these are centered on our main site, which is Trail Valley Creek. So if we sort of start from the south end near Inuvik, the Inuvik Weather Station has data from 1960 to present. Our Havokpak Creek research watersheds from 1991 to present. The Trail Valley Creek site, data from about 1979 to present. Moving further north, Hands Creek, similar sort of data from a similar sort of period. And we have a network of ground temperature and snow monitoring sites, which we've initiated the last few years. I should mention that our data collection has been impacted by COVID, but we have close collaborations with the Aurora Research Institute in Inuvik, and we have a Wilfrid Laurier Research Office in Inuvik in Yellowknife with full-time staff there. So some of the transportation issues related with COVID weren't as bad for us, and we've been able to keep most of our observations going throughout the last year and a half, 2 years of COVID. So Trail Valley Creek Research Observatory is our main research site, sort of centered in the middle of that transect, 58 square kilometers in area, continuous permafrost, active layered depths from about 0.5 to 1 meters. It's in the Taiga Tundra transition zone, so it's primarily tundra, but with patches of shrubs and forest. And as I mentioned before, the site is warming and drying, and we have 3 subbasins that are monitored within Trail Valley, and we have complete monitoring of tundra, shrubs, forest, and lakes across the region. Our camp facilities, we have an electrical system which allows for year-round operation of the site with 3 weather havens, a sea can, and sleeping tents, and can easily accommodate 10 to 15 people year-round. And the Aurora Research Institute in Inuvik co-manages the facility for us. And I'd say the system has been under development for the last 5 to 6 years, and we could probably consider it as fully operational this year. And we're developing increased use of the station for a broad range of monitoring, research, and collaboration activities. So the research framework that we're using and have for quite a while is to integrate our observations across this area with remote sensing and high-resolution modeling to understand past and future changes in water, and to develop collaborations to understand the sort of broader environmental changes. In terms of the observation network from a water side, I think it's rather unique in the Canadian Arctic anyway. We have very robust year-round observations of snow and soil moisture. We're monitoring all aspects of permafrost. We have a pretty extensive precipitation monitoring program. We're looking at shrubification and beavers. In terms of stream flow, we're monitoring everything from spring runoff through to winter icings. We're monitoring a number of lakes and lake drainage events, and we have a large system of eddy covariance towers over each of the landscape types for both evapotranspiration and greenhouse gases, and we have a network of auto chambers for measuring greenhouse gas fluxes from all of the main vegetation types. We're using remote sensing to expand our spatial coverage. We have a recently funded project through the Canadian Space Agency looking at using surface water and ocean topography data, both air SWAT at the moment and SWAT satellite when it's once launched. We, through a number of partners, have been carrying out a variety of aircraft remote sensing, and we've been using drones and structure from motion to map snow depth, shown in this case, as well as vegetation. And we're using a variety of modeling to expand the spatial and temporal coverage of our work. So we'll be using the Canadian Hydrological Model, the Advanced Terrestrial Simulator, the Canadian Small Lake Model, and the Geotop Model. So each of these has a variety of approaches to modeling water and lakes and permafrost throughout the region. And we've developed pretty extensive collaboration with national and international groups, including NASA Above Project, with Alfred Wegener Institute with both remote sensing and modeling, and with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Canadian Space Agency for various aircraft remote sensing of snow depth, snow water equivalent, and snow density. In terms of questions, what are the sort of biggest changes we're seeing? I think the biggest one and the most difficult to explain is earlier spring snowmelt, but delayed spring snowmelt runoff. We've observed decreased end of winter snow cover in this region because of the decreased winter snowfall. Shrubs are expanding across the area, as is beaver expansion. And there's been a rapid increase in lake drainage events over the last 20 years, which is difficult to explain as well. And the remote sensing and modeling work we're doing is aimed at transferability to other regions. Key drivers, I think climate obviously, but in terms of the warming and drying climate, extreme high temperature events in the summer and decreased in the extreme low temperature events in the winter, I think, are crucially important, as is the decrease in winter snowfall. Changes in shrub cover have complex impacts, I think, with effects on evapotranspiration, but also on blowing snow sublimation and end of winter snow cover. And changes in active layer, ice wedge cracking, and lake levels are also key drivers. And I think the integrated impacts of all of these are so important. We're engaging with local communities. We have an MOU with the Inuvialuit Fisheries Joint Management Committee, an MOU with Aurora Research Institute, and a 20-year partnership between the government of the NWT and Laureate University. So the next steps, I think, are really enhancing our collaboration and continuing with our graduate student recruitment. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Phil. That was great. Okay, so that wraps up all of our speakers, and I noticed that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. I can read those out. It's not clear who they're addressed to, so maybe if all the speakers can consider whether or not the questions apply to them. So the first asks, it says, plant growth incorporates more organic matter, which in turn increases the soil organic carbon. How can plant growth help in reducing warming? So maybe to put a spin on this, across these sites, are people seeing more plant growth or reduced plant growth? I know a couple of you touched on plants. Does anyone want to?
I can jump in there if you want. I mean, at our sites, we're seeing enhanced tree growth just south of the tree line, and our tundra sites are certainly seeing expanded growth of shrubs and increased growth rates, densification of shrub patches, and extension of shrub patches, but not yet really new shrub patches developing.
Okay.
And
are other sites?
Yeah,
go
and
ahead.
we would do something similar to that in terms of an increased expansion of existing shrub patches with some interaction with surface hydrology across the landscape.
I'll speak to it from mountain region perspective, and this isn't based on my research. This is based on what we found when we did the IPCC report a couple years ago. And that's that most regions, mountain regions of the world, we see decreased plant growth, but there are exceptions such as the Tibetan Plateau. So where and when precipitation regimes and or permafrost and there's sufficient water, in a warmer world, the mountain plants can grow more. But a lot of other regions, plants are running into not enough water. So even with it warming up at high elevations, they're not growing more necessarily.
Melissa, I see you are going to maybe mention something.
Yeah, just from the remote sensing work that's been done at Cape Bounty has demonstrated that there's been greening over the last decade and a half associated with the warming. And so I think it speaks to what Heidi just said, is that there's more moisture in addition to warmth. So
And I mean, just building on this, have there been any, I guess more for the subarctic, Arctic sites, has there been any cross-site synthesis of changes in vegetation patterns that you're aware of?
Well, I know that the ITEX folks have done a lot of work looking at that. So I'm not really familiar with the literature, except that I know that they've done a number of different synthesis papers in recent years, and Greg Henry's been sort of from UBC has been heading up a lot of the recent synthesis work. I would look to that probably.
Yeah. For our sites, I mean, there's been detailed studies, remote sensing and ground-based along our entire corridor. Jen Baltzer and Trevor Lance have led much of that work, but not sort of direct comparisons with other nearby sites or other related sites across the Canadian Arctic that I know of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's something to note. Let's see, the next question here is, it's again plant related. Will plant growth near the depleting lakes and wetlands in the watershed help restore them? If yes, what about the methane feedback? So Phil, maybe this is related to some of the changes in the lakes that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Some of the lakes, there's a number of oddities in the hydrological change to a warming and drying climate in this area, and related changes in stream flow that are hard to explain. And from a lake perspective and a vegetation perspective, some of the upland lakes that have very small drainage basins to them, you would expect to be drying and shrinking because it is getting warmer. The snow-covered period is getting shorter. You'd imagine evaporation is increasing, but many of these lakes show no indication of declining lake levels. So one of in the back of my head hypothesis is that there's more shrub growth around the edges of the lakes, which trap more blowing snow in the winter, so they actually have a larger supply of snowmelt runoff. So in that sense, vegetation changes may be helping to maintain lakes anyway.
Okay, thank you. Let's just see, there's some stuff in the chat here. Okay, thanks, Heidi. Heidi's posted a couple of a synthesis paper. And then
I think to follow up, I think Stan and actually everybody made a very, connecting theme about changing hydrology. So I wonder how much do we know about the subsurface architecture, especially in, Arctic sites, and how much of a groundwater contribution are we seeing in your sites?
Yeah, Bhavna, that's one of the things that since we started NG Arctic in 2012, that's been an area that has really come to the forefront for us. And we've coupled that with some geophysical analyses and modeling to try to understand, as I commented on, talc formation and subsurface flow paths. Now, we have a long history of looking at surface flow and discharge to surrounding lakes and streams, but not so much that subsurface component. But I think depending on whether you're in continuous or discontinuous permafrost, hill slope regions, I think there's a lot going on below ground that we just yet haven't captured either through our measurements like geophysics or through our subsurface modeling. And we would like to extend those applications of some of our fine scale modeling to other international sites.
Phil?
Yeah, if I can jump in there, I completely agree with that, Stan. It's the same issues we're having. I mean, for a long time, we kind of assumed that some of the small creeks and stream channels completely froze up pretty early in the winter and remained frozen throughout the winter. But that's clearly not the case. And we've had a PhD student looking that along our transect. And there was a picture in one of my slides of stream icings. So what we're finding is more stream icings, more that the unfrozen ground below these small stream channels remain open much longer through the winter than they have in the past. And especially in watersheds with some lakes, the lakes continue to feed groundwater into the stream channels well into maybe January or February even in this region. So we unfortunately don't really know how big of a change it is because we didn't look at these in great detail in the past. Mm-hmm. But after the Inuvik Highway was built a few years ago, the areas underneath the bridges accumulate much less snow. So they freeze deeper, they act as a block and force the groundwater through the river stream channels to the surface. And we see this stream icings forming there. So it's a really nice natural way, not natural, a nice impact of the Inuvik Highway that it was illustrating to us how much groundwater flow beneath the stream channels occurs well into the winter now.
Mm-hmm. I think for our sites too, we are seeing like in the mountainous regions that these, intermittent rivers and not perennial streams, much higher, are very, very important, especially to the dissolved organic carbon. So I see Melissa, did you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, even in the continuous permafrost, we're starting to realize that, the absence of knowledge of what's going on in the subsurface is an issue, because, all of the sort of hydrochemical tracer work is suggesting that there's more and more, even if they're just preferential flow paths, but that, we see these massive, changes in these large lakes. Like we've seen a 300% to 500% increase in sulfate concentrations in these lakes that are huge. And so there's something going on under the surface, because the surface flow doesn't explain that. So we know that subsurface hydrological change is happening. We just are lacking the tools to really pinpoint where and to what extent it's happening.
Thanks. Heidi, did you unmute, or were you going to comment on something else? Or?
I wasn't, but I do want to share that I found permafrost in the Southern Rocky Mountains this summer, which is pretty exciting to find. And I've been hunting for it ever since I worked on the IPCC report. Bhavna, it's not in the East River watershed, so we're going to have to expand our zone of work. But I share that in part because it's really fun to be part of the session and be hearing about permafrost. And I don't know what to do now that I found it. So I might be reaching out to some of my permafrost colleagues that I'm meeting today. I think that's a part of science that is really what CUAHSI and this collaboration that Bhavna, you all are trying to build, is that we can be present in the space we know best and find something new. And then we need friends. We need to find ways to connect to other people, because we don't know how to do everything that might be most exciting to do next. And we want to find those ways to build those pieces. So I really appreciate y'all bringing us together.
Thank you for being appreciative of this. I think we are super, the early career cohort group is super appreciative of this. We're seeing so many connecting themes and questions that we can build together and work on it together. So with that, thank you to all our speakers. I see another Q&A, but maybe we can save it for later. We are at time. So thank you, and we should close this session. Claire, did you want to add something? Or?
Just thank you to everyone, to the speakers and to the audience for joining. And a reminder again that there's another session next week on September 7th, and it will be focused on managed and agricultural sites. So please join for that if that's of interest to you.
All right, bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.